He thought he knew who belonged until he met the man in seat 1A. The slap echoed through the first-class cabin, cutting through the quiet hum of conversation, silencing the clinking of glasses and the rustling of newspapers. Elaine Carter, a seasoned flight attendant, had spent over a decade serving the world's most powerful men, but tonight, she had made a mistake that would cost her everything. She had questioned him, doubted him, treated him as if he was an intruder in a space she believed he did not belong. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man in seat 1A was Daniel Rhodes, the owner of the very airline she worked for. And now, her world was about to collapse. This isn't just a story about a flight gone wrong. It's about power, perception, and the quiet rules that shape our world until they are broken. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And if you love stories that challenge the way we think, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Now let's begin. The first-class cabin of Flight 417 was a cocoon of quiet luxury. A place where the privileged moved through the air with the ease of gods. Sipping champagne above the world. The lights were dimmed to a soft glow. The hum of the engines a gentle, reassuring lull. Passengers buried themselves in newspapers, business reports, or expensive distractions. The kind of things that made a man feel important. Daniel Rhodes, seated in 1A, was not reading. He was not demanding a drink or making small talk with the flight attendants. He was simply being, and that was the problem. He sat with the stillness of a man who knew himself, who knew the weight of his presence without needing to announce it. His charcoal suit, well-tailored but subtle, rested against his broad shoulders. A silver watch gleamed at his wrist. Not ostentatious, but unmistakably expensive to those who knew quality. He did not move with urgency, did not fidget, did not seek the eyes of others for approval or permission. And that was the kind of thing that unsettled people like Elaine Carter, the flight attendant assigned to first class that evening. At first, it was just a feeling. Something small, barely a whisper in the back of her mind. He doesn't belong. The thought came unbidden, and yet it did not surprise her. These thoughts never did. She watched him from the corner of her eye as she moved through the cabin, topping off glasses, exchanging pleasantries with men who barely acknowledged her. They belonged. They announced their importance through their voices, their entitled gestures, the way they expected the world to accommodate them. But this man, this Daniel Rhodes, was too quiet, too self-contained. She told herself she was being careful, that she had spent too many years in the air not to trust her instincts. But beneath that self-assurance, beneath the uniform she wore like armor, was something else, something uglier. And so she stopped beside seat 1A. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice light, neutral, the way one might handle an animal they were unsure would bite. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" A hush fell over the cabin. Daniel Rhodes looked up at her, slow and deliberate, like he had already expected this moment. His deep brown eyes met hers, unwavering, unafraid. He did not furrow his brow in confusion or bristle with offense. He did not stammer out a response like a man who had been caught somewhere he should not be. Instead, he reached calmly into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her. Elaine took it, her fingers pressing into the thick cardstock as her eyes scanned the details. Seat 1A, first class, verified. Her stomach tightened. His name was there, his seat assignment correct, his presence here authorized. But still, something inside her refused to let it go. She forced a smile, polite but strained, and handed the ticket back. "Thank you," she said, though it did not feel like thanks. It felt like doubt, barely disguised. She turned away, but she did not move far. Instead, she lingered near the front of the cabin, watching from the periphery. "Something's not right," she murmured to Carla, another flight attendant preparing drinks. Carla glanced up, frowning. "What do you mean?" Elaine leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Passenger in 1A, something feels off." Carla followed her gaze, eyes landing on Daniel, then back to Elaine. "You checked his ticket, didn't you?" "I did," Elaine admitted. "It's valid." "But..." Carla set down the drink she had been pouring, folding her arms. "But what?" Elaine hesitated. There was no but. Not one she could say out loud. He was polite. He followed the rules. His seat was paid for in full. And yet, Elaine looked at him again, her jaw tightening. "I'm going to find out," she muttered, already walking back toward 1A. This time, when she stopped beside him, She placed a hand on the empty seat in front of him, grounding herself. "Sir," she said again, "I just need to confirm, are you traveling alone?" Daniel lowered his magazine, studying her now, like a teacher sizing up a student who had not done their homework. "Yes," he said, the words slow and even. Elaine pressed on. "And your ticket, was it upgraded?" Silence stretched between them. This time, Daniel did not answer right away. He sat still, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the magazine before he responded. "No," he said, "it was not upgraded. I purchased it." His voice was smooth, uninterested in the game she was playing. Elaine folded her arms, shifting her weight. "Do you mind showing me your ID?" A few heads turned now. Subtle movements from passengers pretending not to listen. The energy in the cabin shifted. Something thick in the air. Unspoken but felt. Daniel exhaled quietly, closed his magazine, and reached for his wallet. He pulled out his ID and handed it to her, his eyes never leaving her face. Elaine took it, gripping the plastic a little too tightly as she scanned the details. Name: Daniel Rhodes. Photo: a perfect match. Information: flawless. And yet, she still did not move. She stood there, gripping the ID longer than necessary, eyes narrowing slightly as she stared at him. There had to be something wrong. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice just as calm as before but with an edge now. "Is there a problem, miss?" The words landed heavier than they should have, making something coiled tight in Elaine's chest. There was something in his tone, not aggressive, not defensive, just firm. A warning. She swallowed, glancing at the ID one more time before finally handing it back. "No problem," she said, though the words felt forced, like they had been pried from her throat. Daniel took his ID, sliding it back into his wallet. He said nothing else. He simply picked up his magazine and resumed reading, as if their exchange had never happened. But Elaine's heart was pounding. She turned sharply, walking back toward the galley, her breath coming faster than before. Something wasn't right. She had checked his ticket. She had checked his ID. She had verified everything, and still she didn't believe it. Her mind refused to let it go, refused to accept that she was wrong. Passengers didn't just make her feel this uneasy for no reason. She yanked out her work tablet, opened the airline manifest again, scrolling down, her eyes landing on his name once more. Everything was correct, and yet, her gut still screamed at her, "I'm going to catch him." She didn't know why she felt the need to. She only knew that she did. The silence in the first-class cabin thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. Elaine Carter felt it pressing against her skin, making her uniform feel tight, her breath a little shallow. She had been in the air for over a decade. And yet, something about this man, this moment, this feeling wouldn't let her go. She knew first-class passengers. She knew how they moved, how they carried themselves, how they expected to be treated. Daniel Rhodes did not behave like them. That was the thing about power, it usually announced itself. It came in the form of expensive demands, raised voices, careless entitlement. It came in a man clicking his fingers for another drink without so much as looking up from his laptop. It came in a woman draped in luxury, sighing loudly when service was not fast enough. But Daniel was silent, measured, composed, and that, more than anything, made him suspicious. Elaine had seen men like him before, men who moved through spaces they were not expected to occupy. Men who did not ask for permission but still made the room uncomfortable just by existing in it. She had seen them in business lounges, in high-end restaurants, in luxury stores where clerks followed them like shadows, watching. This was the unspoken rule of the world. There were places where some men belonged, and places where others did not. Elaine glanced at seat 1A again, her jaw tightening. No, something about him wasn't right. The search for a reason. She tapped her fingers against the tablet in her hands, scrolling through the passenger manifest again. Daniel Rhodes, first class, paid in full, no upgrades, no red flags. Her pulse quickened. There had to be something. She flipped to the airline's internal database, the system that tracked high-profile passengers, the VIPs who required extra discretion. Her stomach clenched when she saw it. Access restricted. The screen blinked at her, unyielding. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. The only time she had seen restricted access was for executives, dignitaries, people with real power, people whose presence on a flight was not meant to be questioned. Her grip tightened on the tablet. No, no, there has to be a mistake. She tried again. Same result. Locked. Untouchable. A bead of sweat prickled at the back of her neck. She turned abruptly toward Carla, her fellow flight attendant, who was now watching her with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What are you doing?" Carla asked, her voice low, wary. Elaine ignored the question. "You ever seen a passenger with a restricted profile before?" Carla frowned. "Only for execs." "Why?" Elaine's throat was dry. "Because I think I just." Her voice faltered. Because she already knew what she had done. She had just humiliated a man who was not supposed to be questioned. The moment of no return. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, Elaine was moving back down the aisle, back toward seat 1A. She slowed her pace just before reaching him. Controlling her breath, she could feel the eyes of the first-class passengers on her. Waiting, sensing that something was off but unsure of what. Daniel had not moved. His posture was the same. His expression unreadable. But there was something in the air between them now, something unspoken but heavy. A weight that could not be ignored. Elaine placed both hands on the headrest of the seat across from him. Leaning in slightly. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, keeping her voice polite but firm. Too polite, too firm, the way people speak when they want to remind you who has the authority. Daniel set down his magazine and looked up at her. He did not blink. "Yes?" Her throat tightened. She should stop. She should let it go. But she didn't. "Would you mind telling me what you do for a living?" The question landed like a slap. The first-class cabin stilled. Elaine saw the slightest flicker in his expression. The barest tilt of his head, not in confusion. Not in offense. But in something else. Something that made her chest tighten. A slow inhale. Then, a smile. Not a pleasant one. Not an amused one. A knowing one. "Why?" Elaine swallowed. "I'm just curious." Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her now, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Curious?" he repeated. His voice was calm, deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. "Or suspicious?" Elaine's breath caught. Something inside her coiled tight. This was not how these things were supposed to go. Passengers like him, they were supposed to flinch. To justify themselves. To explain. But Daniel did not flinch. And suddenly, she felt small. "I own an airline," he said simply. Elaine felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The restricted profile, the unshakable composure, the fact that he had let her do this. Let her walk straight into this moment like a fool. A chill ran through her. "You own." Daniel nodded. That small, knowing smile never fading. "That's what I said." Elaine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not just a man in first class. This was the man who owned the very airline she worked for. She had just spent the past hour trying to prove he didn't belong. And now, her entire world was about to collapse. The turning point. Elaine took a step back, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Passengers were whispering now, some shifting in their seats, others avoiding eye contact entirely, as if they, too, had played along in this unspoken assumption and now felt its weight. Daniel picked up his water glass and took a slow sip. Unbothered, completely in control. Elaine, however, felt like the walls were closing in. She turned sharply, nearly stumbling as she moved back toward the galley. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came too fast. "No, no, no." She yanked open the curtain. Stumbling inside, Carla turned, her brow furrowed. "Elaine, what?" "I need to talk to the captain," Elaine blurted. Carla's eyes widened. "What? Why?" Elaine's mind was spinning, words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Because if he really is who he says he is." She swallowed hard. "Then I just made the biggest mistake of my career." Carla's face paled. Elaine knew what came next. She knew, because she had seen it happen before. The captain would be called. The airline would be informed. A decision would be made. And when this plane landed, she would not be walking off it as a flight attendant. She would be walking off with security. The weight of her own actions crushed her chest. Because now, she realized the truth. This had never been about Daniel Rhodes. It had always been about her. Elaine Carter had always prided herself on control. She had spent years navigating the confined space of an airplane, knowing exactly how to handle passengers, when to placate, when to enforce, when to push back. She had dealt with entitled businessmen, weary celebrities, anxious first-time flyers. She had been firm when necessary, gentle when required, but now she felt like the air around her had thickened, pressing against her ribs, making each breath more difficult than the last. She had made a mistake. No, it was more than that. She had walked, willingly, blindly, into the kind of mistake that ended careers. And the worst part? She had done it for no reason at all. The captain's verdict. Elaine stood outside the cockpit, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She knocked once, twice, before the heavy door clicked open. Captain Reynolds stood there, his expression already hardened. He had been flying for 3 decades, had seen it all, and yet, when he looked at her now, there was something in his eyes that sent a slow, sinking feeling through her chest. "What's the issue?" he asked, his voice level. Elaine hesitated. "How do you explain something like this?" She swallowed. I questioned a first-class passenger." The captain's brows pulled together. "And?" Elaine forced herself to keep going. "And she exhaled sharply, looking down for half a second before meeting his eyes again. "I might have just questioned the man who owns the airline." Silence. Reynolds didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple as if trying to will the headache away. Jesus Christ. Elaine felt something cold rush through her veins. She had hoped desperately that he would tell her she was mistaken, that there had been some misunderstanding, that Daniel Rhodes was nothing more than a well-off passenger with an air of quiet authority. But he wasn't. Reynolds turned to his first officer, Patel, who had been listening quietly from his seat, his face unreadable. "Pull up the passenger log," Reynolds ordered. Patel did as he was told, his fingers flying over the tablet in his lap. A few seconds passed, then he let out a low whistle. "Yep," Patel muttered. "Daniel Rhodes, chairman and majority shareholder of Aerotrans Airlines." Elaine felt the words hit her like a slap to the face. She had humiliated the man who signed her paycheck. Reynolds looked back at her, his jaw tightening. "You just questioned the most powerful man in the airline industry as if he was some kind of imposter." Elaine opened her mouth to explain, to justify, to plead, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing she could say. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "You're done for the day." Elaine's stomach dropped. "Sir, no." His voice was clipped. "Final. You already did enough." Elaine felt herself start to spiral. "But I didn't know who he was." She tried, her voice smaller now, weaker. Reynolds let out a cold laugh. "And that's the problem." Those 5 words hit harder than she was prepared for. "You'll disembark with security when we land." Her breath caught. Her entire world tilted. She had seen it happen before, flight attendants escorted off planes, quiet and ashamed, their careers reduced to a footnote in a corporate decision. And now, it was happening to her. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, the reality crashing into her chest like turbulence she hadn't braced for. "This isn't just about you," Reynolds continued. His voice had softened just slightly, but the weight of what he was saying was crushing. "You embarrassed the airline, and you embarrassed yourself." Elaine felt her vision blur, but she refused to break. She gave a stiff nod and turned on her heel, leaving the cockpit before she could do something truly humiliating like cry. The weight of the cabin. She stepped back into first class, and the weight of what she had done settled onto her shoulders like 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. Because they were watching. They had seen her question him. They had seen her doubt him. They had seen her fail. Some looked away, embarrassed for her. Others, the worst ones, looked smug, as if enjoying the spectacle of someone falling apart in real time. And then there was Daniel Rhodes. He was still seated in 1A, perfectly composed, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Elaine could feel the heat of shame crawling up her neck, but she forced herself forward, past the eyes, past the weight, past the tension, back into the galley, where Carla and Michael were waiting. Michael's jaw was tight, his arms crossed. "Denise, what the hell? I don't want to talk about it." Elaine snapped, her voice too sharp, too raw, but Carla wasn't having it. "Well, you're going to have to," she said, her voice even but firm. "Because I just heard from the captain." Elaine's hands tightened on the counter. "He told you?" Carla shook her head. "No, but I heard him on the phone with corporate." Elaine felt her stomach churn. Michael exhaled loudly, rubbing a hand down his face. So what now? Elaine didn't answer, because she already knew what came next. The punishment would be swift, quiet, absolute. Corporate would review her. She would probably be fired. And Daniel Rhodes, the man she had treated like a fraud in his own kingdom, would say nothing. Because he didn't have to. He had already won. The shift. The in-flight phone rang. Elaine flinched. Michael picked it up. Yes, Captain? A pause. His eyes flickered toward Elaine. He nodded, then hung up slowly, turning back to face her. You're not getting off with security anymore. Elaine's heart stopped. What? Michael gestured toward seat 1A. He changed his mind. Elaine felt the air leave her lungs. She turned, looking toward Daniel Rhodes. He was already watching her. His expression calm, unreadable. He had spared her. But why? Elaine swallowed hard. Because she knew the answer. Daniel Rhodes wasn't just teaching her a lesson. He was teaching all of them. The passengers, the crew, the people who had sat in silence while she had tried to strip him of his right to belong. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about something worse. Making her live with it. And she would. For the rest of her life. There was a silence that stretched through the first-class cabin, not an ordinary quiet. Not the subdued murmur of a red-eye flight or the polite stillness of men nursing whiskey over a sea of clouds. This silence was thick, weighted, the kind of hush that follows an exposed truth. The kind that lingers after an unspoken rule has been broken wide open. Elaine Carter stood frozen in the galley, gripping the countertop as if it were the only thing keeping her from sinking into the ground beneath her feet. He changed his mind. The words still rang in her ears. Daniel Rhodes had spared her. But the thing about mercy, the thing no one tells you, is that it often comes with a heavier burden than punishment ever could. The walk back. Elaine could feel the pulse in her throat as she stepped out of the galley. Forcing her feet forward. The first-class cabin, once a space she had commanded with ease, now felt hostile. The air buzzed with something unspoken, thick with an awareness that had not been there before. Passengers, those same men and women who had watched her question him, now stared down at their laps, their screens, their untouched glasses of champagne. They had played their role in this, a silent jury, content to let the interrogation unfold, until the moment it became clear that the accused was, in fact, the most powerful man in the room. She wondered if any of them felt shame. If any of them were replaying the way they had sat in complicit stillness while she had done what she did. And then there was Daniel Rhodes. He remained exactly as he had been, calm, measured, unshaken. But when she reached seat 1A, he lifted his eyes to meet hers. And in them, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not anger, not even disappointment. Something worse. Understanding. He had seen this before. He had seen her before. She cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Rhodes. She faltered. Because what do you say? How do you apologize when the very thing you are sorry for is not a mistake, but a reflex? How do you ask forgiveness for something you hadn't even realized you believed until the moment you were forced to face it? She swallowed hard. I was wrong. Her voice trembled, but she pushed through. Completely wrong. And I appreciate your patience more than I deserve. A slow pause. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then, he nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in approval, just in acknowledgement, as if to say, yes, you were wrong, and now you know it. The unraveling. Elaine turned, stepping back toward the galley, feeling her breath come faster than it should. She didn't know why it felt like this, why the air seemed too thick. Why her pulse wouldn't settle. Why it felt as if her entire world had shifted on its axis. Because the truth was, she had thought herself better than this. She had always believed she was fair, good at her job, good at reading people, good at knowing who was supposed to be where. She had never thought of herself as someone who would do this. But here she was. She gripped the edge of the counter, her mind racing. Was it the suit, the quietness, the way he hadn't performed his presence the way the other men in first class did? Or was it just him? The color of his skin, the way he occupied a space without seeking permission, the way he belonged without needing to prove it. Her breath hitched, shame curling tight in her chest. Because it had never been about his ticket, or his seat, or his ID. It had been about her. The final word. Elaine wasn't sure how much time had passed when she heard her name. Elaine. She turned sharply, her stomach flipping as she saw Daniel standing now. His coat draped effortlessly over one arm. The plane was preparing for landing. The passengers beginning to gather their belongings. But somehow, he still moved at his own pace. Unhurried, she opened her mouth, but he lifted a hand not to silence her, but to hold the moment where it was. "You know why I changed my mind?" he asked. Elaine's throat was dry. "No, sir." Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Because accountability means more than punishment." Elaine felt something shift inside her. Because in that moment, she understood. He could have destroyed her. He could have let the consequences unfold as they were meant to. Let her be escorted off the plane in shame. Let her name be whispered through the corridors of the airline industry as a warning. A cautionary tale. But he hadn't. Because he didn't need to. What he had done instead was worse. He had made her see herself. And now, she would have to live with that. For the rest of her life. Daniel nodded once, as if to say, "That's all," before turning, walking toward the exit with the same quiet authority that had unsettled her from the start. Passengers parted for him. Some looked at him with newfound respect. Others with shame. And Elaine simply watched him go, knowing she would never be the same again. The plane would land soon. But the lesson would never leave her. The descent had begun. The plane tilted forward, engines humming as it cut through the dense sky, drawing ever closer to the earth. The passengers in first class barely noticed. They moved in slow, deliberate motions, slipping tablets into briefcases, adjusting watches, exchanging murmured conversations that held no real weight. But Elaine Carter felt everything. Her body registered each small tremor of turbulence, each shift in altitude, each moment ticking closer to a landing she was not ready to face. Because for the first time in her life, she understood that some landings were more than just physical. Some landings changed you. The weight of silence. The first-class cabin was unusually quiet, though not in the way it had been before. This silence was different. It was the silence of men and women thinking too much. Of people realizing perhaps for the first time that they had been part of something they could not take back. Because they had been there. They had watched. And, in their silence, they had allowed it to happen. Elaine's hands clenched at her sides as she moved stiffly through the cabin. Making last-minute checks, she could feel their eyes on her. Some passengers met her gaze with a flicker of discomfort before looking away. Others, the worst ones, refused to look at her at all, as if ignoring her existence would erase their role in what had happened. But there was no erasing this. Not for them, and certainly not for her. The glances that said everything. As she moved down the aisle, she felt a hand brush against her arm. She turned sharply, her breath catching. A woman, mid-50s, blonde, elegant, one of the many passengers who had sat in silence while she questioned Daniel Rhodes. The woman hesitated, her lips parting like she was about to speak, then closing just as quickly. Elaine waited for an apology, a whispered acknowledgement, some quiet admittance of shared guilt. But the woman only gave her a look Elaine had seen before. Many times over. It was the look of someone who wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but was too afraid to say it aloud. So instead, she offered a smile, small, hesitant, the kind that begged for Elaine's approval. As if a single polite expression could erase what had been done. Elaine did not smile back. The woman's face reddened. She turned, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck, returning to her untouched glass of wine. Elaine swallowed hard, because she knew what that woman had wanted. She had wanted forgiveness. She had wanted to be absolved without having to own the weight of what had happened. But Elaine was not in the business of giving forgiveness so easily. Not anymore. The captain's final word. A chime rang overhead. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Elaine exhaled, pressing her palms against the smooth, polished surface of the galley counter. She had survived this flight. But what came next? Her career? Her reputation? She didn't know. All she knew was that when the wheels of this plane touched down, she would step off it as someone she no longer recognized. The intercom buzzed again, but this time, it was Captain Reynolds' voice. "Ms. Carter, see me before you disembark." Elaine's stomach dropped. She felt Carla shift beside her, felt Michael glance up from where he was securing the beverage cart. Both of them aware that something was about to happen. Michael murmured, "What now?" Elaine didn't answer, because she had no idea. The moment of truth. As soon as the plane touched down, passengers stood, stretching, pulling luggage from overhead compartments. Elaine moved through the chaos, her steps too careful, too deliberate. As she made her way toward the cockpit, she knocked. The door swung open immediately. Captain Reynolds stood inside, arms crossed. His face was unreadable. Elaine stepped in, her pulse hammering in her ears. The door clicked shut behind her. A pause. Then, he called. Elaine's breath hitched. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Daniel Rhodes." The words felt like a slap. "And," she forced out. Reynolds let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "He said he doesn't want you fired." Elaine's knees nearly buckled. "What?" Said it himself. "Doesn't want you fired. Doesn't want you punished." A long, heavy pause. "Just wants you to think about what you did." Elaine could not breathe, because somehow, this felt worse than being fired. This was not an escape. This was not mercy. This was a sentence that would live inside her, crawl beneath her skin, settle into the very marrow of her bones. And she deserved it. Reynolds' eyes softened just a little. "Go home, Carter." Elaine nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Then she turned, stepping out of the cockpit, out of the plane, and into a world that would never feel the same again. The lesson that lingers. Some lessons do not leave you. Some lessons are not taught in moments of explosion, but in the silence afterward. Elaine Carter had spent her life believing she was a good person, that she knew right from wrong. But now she knew the truth. And the truth was, she had been part of the problem all along. And now, for the rest of her life, she would have to live with that. The airport was a machine, cold, indifferent, relentless. Bodies moved with quiet urgency. Rolling suitcases clicking against polished tile. Voices blending into a low murmur of connection and departure. Some walked with purpose, their presence a declaration of importance. Others moved through the space unnoticed, like ghosts passing between the living. Elaine Carter stood in the middle of it, feeling neither here nor there. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times before. But today, she did not recognize it. She did not recognize herself. Because she had come off that flight a different woman than the one who had stepped onto it. And the weight of that was suffocating. The echo of it all. The further she walked from the gate, the harder it became to silence the voice in her head. It followed her like a shadow, replaying every moment, every decision, every choice. The way she had doubted him. The way she had questioned him. The way she had felt so right, so certain, so justified. Until the moment she wasn't. Until the moment the truth had crushed her like a tidal wave. She passed a row of flight attendants waiting for their next shift. Their crisp uniforms untouched by the stain of shame that now clung to her own. She imagined them hearing about what had happened. Because they would. Stories like this did not stay confined to one flight. By tomorrow, every attendant, every pilot, every corporate executive would know. And when they saw her, what would they think? Would they see the woman she had believed herself to be? Or would they see her for who she truly was? She swallowed hard. The answer too painful to face. The familiar stranger. The terminal stretched ahead, its fluorescent lights flickering in the dull haze of early evening. And then there he was. Daniel Rhodes, standing near the exit, his coat draped over one arm, his presence as effortless as ever. Elaine stopped short, her breath lodging in her throat. She could have turned around. She could have walked the other way. She could have disappeared into the crowd. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because there was something about this moment, something inevitable. Something that felt like the closing of a door she had left open for far too long. Daniel turned slightly, catching sight of her. For a moment, he simply watched. His expression was unreadable. And that was the worst part. Because she could have handled anger. She could have handled contempt. She could have handled a sharp, biting reminder of what she had done. But not this. Not patience. Not understanding. Not the look of a man who had seen too many versions of her before. Elaine forced herself forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. She stopped a few feet away. The space between them too vast. Too weighted with unspoken things. She wanted to say something. But what could she say? What words could undo what had already been done? Daniel sighed. A long, quiet exhale that somehow felt heavier than words. "You're thinking too much." Elaine blinked. "What?" He studied her, his head tilting slightly. "You're thinking about how this will follow you. About what people will say. About whether you'll be able to move past it. Her pulse quickened. Because he was right. Of course, he was right. And, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel let a small, knowing smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It will follow you. But that's the cost of seeing. Elaine's breath hitched. The cost of seeing? He nodded. You can't unsee yourself now. That's the real weight of all this. Isn't it? And God help her. He was right again. It wasn't just about what had happened. It wasn't just about the humiliation. The almost firing. The whispers that would spread through the airline industry like wildfire. It was about the knowing. Because before today, she could have told herself a different story. She could have believed she was fair. She could have believed she was objective. She could have believed that she was the kind of woman who didn't make mistakes like this. But now she knew better. And there was no going back. Her hands clenched at her sides. Her throat tightening with a frustration she didn't know how to name. That's not exactly comforting, she muttered. Daniel let out a soft chuckle. It's not supposed to be. Another silence stretched between them. Elaine shifted on her feet. You didn't have to spare me. Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. No, I didn't. Her breath felt uneven now. Then why did you? He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he answered. Because accountability means more than punishment. Elaine closed her eyes for half a second, letting the words settle into the deepest part of her. She thought back to every moment of that flight. To every decision she had made. To every assumption she had held so tightly in her hands. Convinced they were the truth. She had spent her whole life believing that she understood right and wrong. That she knew how to read people. That she could tell who belonged and who didn't. And yet, in one flight, in one unshakable moment of reckoning, she had been proven completely and utterly wrong. She let out a slow breath. I don't know how to fix this. Daniel nodded, as if he had expected that. That's the point. Elaine looked at him, searching for something, some kind of resolution. Some way to make peace with the thing that now lived inside her. But there was no easy answer. No neat, wrapped-up ending. Just this moment, this knowing, this weight that she would carry for the rest of her life. And somehow, that was enough. Daniel gave her one last nod, then turned, stepping into the flow of the crowd, disappearing into the moving bodies that filled the terminal. Elaine stood there, alone, letting the lesson settle into her bones. Because this was the cost of seeing. And she would never be blind again. It had been 3 days. 3 days since the flight. Since the confrontation. Since the moment she had seen herself for the first time and hated what she saw. Elaine Carter had spent the past 72 hours waiting for the hammer to fall. She had expected a call from corporate. She had expected an email. A meeting. A quiet dismissal from the airline she had given 10 years of her life. She had expected her colleagues to whisper. To look at her like she was damaged now. Different. Untouchable. But none of that had happened. Not yet. Instead, she moved through the days as if nothing had changed except everything had. Because she had changed. And there was no returning to the woman she had been before. The conversations that weren't had. She had walked into the airport lounge that morning with her uniform crisp. Her posture straight. Her expression unreadable. The other flight attendants had been there. Clustered in their usual groups. Sipping coffee. Scrolling through their phones. Chatting in the way people do when their lives are not on the verge of collapse. Elaine had felt their eyes on her the second she stepped in. But no one said anything. Not directly. Carla had given her a long look, the kind that held questions she wasn't ready to answer. Michael had muttered, "You good? A casual thing? An easy out if she wanted it." And Elaine had taken it. Yeah, a lie. But an easy one. Because the truth was too complicated. The fear that lingers. Elaine had always believed she was the kind of woman who understood the world. She had thought she knew how things worked. She had thought she could read people. That she could sense when something wasn't right. But now, she realized, she had never been reading the world. She had been reading the version of the world that had been given to her. A world where some men are questioned. And others are trusted. A world where some mistakes are small. And others unravel everything. A world where doubt has a color. And certainty has a face. She had never questioned it before. Because she had never needed to. And now it was all she could think about. The question that wouldn't let her go. Elaine sat in the corner of the break room. nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had been staring at the same email draft on her phone for the past hour. 2. Daniel Rhodes. Subject: apology. The cursor blinked. Waiting. She had typed a dozen different versions. Some long, some short, some too careful, too polished, too corporate. None of them felt right. Because how do you apologize to a man who has already forgiven you? How do you explain to him that his forgiveness is not enough because now you cannot forgive yourself? She exhaled sharply and deleted the draft. There was nothing she could say that he did not already know. Because men like him they always knew. And women like her they only learned when it was too late. The lesson that doesn't leave. She went through the motions of her shift. Checked boarding passes. Offered drinks with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nodded at pilots she had known for years. Suddenly unsure of what they thought of her now. Everything looked the same. But it wasn't. Not to her. Because now, she saw it everywhere. The way passengers assumed authority when they had none. The way others were expected to prove themselves in ways that could never be measured. The way some people moved through the world with ease, while others carried the weight of being doubted in every room they entered. She had never noticed before. Now, she could not unsee it. This was the cost of knowing. This was the burden of seeing. And she would carry it for the rest of her life. The sky had not changed. It was the same vast expanse Elaine Carter had spent her life moving through. The same shifting canvas of blue and gray and endless possibility. She had spent years in the air, above the noise of the world, believing herself apart from it, beyond it, but now she knew better. Now, she understood that there was no escaping the weight of the world. No matter how high you flew. Because what had happened on Flight 417 had followed her. It had settled in her chest, beneath her ribs, in the space between each breath. And it would never leave. The world looks different now. She walked through the airport terminal. Her uniform crisp, her steps steady, her hands light at her sides. To anyone watching, she looked the same, but she wasn't. Because now, she noticed things she had once ignored. The way a TSA officer lingered too long on a black man's ID while barely glancing at the next passengers. The way a young woman, not more than 20, clutched her purse a little tighter when a dark-skinned man walked past her. The way a businessman, smug in his certainty, cut in front of a man who would never dare correct him. She had seen all of it before. But never like this. Never with understanding. Never with the knowledge that she, too, had been part of it. That she had played her role. Performed her part. Upheld the quiet, insidious rules of the world without ever questioning them. Until Daniel Rhodes had made her see herself. And now, she could not unsee what it means to carry it. She checked in for her next flight. The motions automatic. The gate agent greeted her. The crew nodded in recognition. She smiled when she needed to. Spoke when it was required. Moved through the world as if nothing had changed. But it had. Because awareness is a kind of pain. It is knowing that what you have done cannot be undone. It is understanding that there is no apology strong enough to erase what has been revealed. It is the realization that the lesson you have learned will never stop teaching you. It was with her now. In the way she saw the passengers board. In the way she felt her own instincts, the flicker of doubt that came before reason. The unconscious judgments that arrived before logic could stop them. She caught herself now. She questioned herself now. But the fact that she had to, that was the weight she would always carry. The passenger in seat 1A. As the plane began to board, Elaine stood near the entrance, greeting passengers as they stepped inside. "Good evening. Welcome aboard. Your seat is just down the aisle." The words came out smooth. Effortless. The kind of politeness she had mastered over the years. And then, a man stepped forward. Seat 1A. He was young, mid-30s, maybe, well-dressed, confident, with the air of someone who belonged in first class without question. Elaine felt it, the instinct rising in her. The old habit, the quiet, poisonous whisper of, "Does he belong here?" Her body tensed. But then she caught it. She saw the thought for what it was. She saw herself for what she had been. And she silenced it. She let it die before it could live. She forced herself to see him as he was, not as her fears had trained her to. She smiled. "Welcome aboard, sir." And this time, for the first time, she truly meant it. The lesson that never ends. The plane took off, climbing into the night, piercing through the clouds. disappearing into the endless, waiting sky. Elaine Carter sat alone in the galley, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. She had been given a second chance. But second chances do not erase first mistakes. They only allow you to decide who you will be moving forward. And she knew, now, that the lesson was not over. The lesson would never be over. Because the world does not change in a moment. The world changes only when people decide, again and again, to change with it. And for the rest of her life, Elaine Carter would have to make that choice. Every day, every flight, every time she was given the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. And that, she knew, was the real weight of the sky.